My name is Mike Konczal. I'm a fellow with the Roosevelt Institute, and this is another installment of Fireside Chats, and I am joined by...
I'm Monica Putz. I'm a senior writer with the American Prospect magazine.
Excellent, and thank you for joining me today. Is it really nice in D.C. today?
It is. It's like 80 degrees. It's actually disconcertingly nice. Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's like 80 degrees here in New York. Like, I put on a jacket and felt bad immediately. So I'm sorry to drag you out of the nice weather and from whatever other work you're doing to talk about poverty of all things. But I'm glad to have you here. You have been writing some really fantastic stuff in the past year and a half about poverty in the United States, both in the Great Recession, but also more broadly. Two stories in particular, one from last summer called Pressing on the Upward Way, was set in Kentucky, and then one just recently, a few weeks ago, maybe it's in the new issue, it's called The Weeklies, which is about the Denver suburbs. So why don't you give us and the viewers some background on these stories?
Sure. Well, I've wanted to cover poverty for some time, and even going back to some of my earliest work as a newspaper reporter, I was drawn to the stories of people struggling economically, which might not necessarily be poverty, but is related to that, how people get into the middle class, how they stay there, and then how they fall out of it. The story about Kentucky was centered on Owsley County, Kentucky, which is one of the poorest counties in the country, and it's the poorest county with a majority of white people. I wanted to go there because I thought that we were doing a special issue on poverty. The whole issue was about poverty. And I wanted to go there because it had a high poverty rate throughout the years since poverty was measured in the 60s. First measured in the 60s, and also because I thought that the way that we thought of rural poverty probably would have changed. The ways that people buy goods, the ways that they go to work, all have changed in the whole country, and that includes places like Owsley County. So a lot of people who live there, maybe in the 60s, if they'd had the same incomes, they would have been, sort of stereotypically Appalachian poor families living in houses without much electricity or without running water. And they very much have all the modern conveniences now, but a lot of things haven't changed. The landscape is just still very much written by poverty and the poverty around it. And so I sort of wanted to explore a modern story of poverty there. And that was last year.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So when you hear a lot of people talk about poverty, particularly the definitions that come out of the 60s, it's, being able to afford basic food, and then it's some multiple of that. And you'll often hear a lot of, particularly conservatives, say, the price of a lot of goods have dropped so dramatically that our thinking of poverty is essentially not that useful anymore. So, for instance, you hear, it's kind of classic, and people giggle at it, but, there's something to the econometrics of it. Say, a poor family will have electricity, we'll have a refrigerator, we'll have a microwave, we'll have a basket of goods that would have been very expensive in the 1950s or 60s. And even little things like, a small calculator, which we take for granted, would be, $50 or whatever back then. How did you see how poverty was experienced in Kentucky, given that a lot of durable goods that make up the middle class of the 50s are now much cheaper? Like, what is the experience of poverty like for the people there?
Yeah, so overall, things like fresh vegetables and, electronic goods are less expensive than they were before. But, it's all still about what's relative. And so people really feel relative poverty. And people who live in areas where they have access to those goods, but they make much less than like the national median income or the national, what the average person does in the United States, knows that they sort of have less access to goods that sort of define Americanness. So even though it's true that on a global scale, American poverty isn't as fundamentally devastating for survival as it is globally. It's also true that people who live in poverty in the United States and live surrounded by poverty, like they did in that area in Kentucky, know that they are worse off than other people in the country economically. And that comes to affect them in different ways. And so, it changes the way they think about opportunity, and it changes the way that they think about movement into the middle class, and it changes the way that they think about sort of defining their economic situation. And so a lot of the families I spoke to there, they could afford things like cell phones, but they might have to miss they might have to pay in advance, and so sometimes their cell phones just don't work because they haven't paid in advance. Or they might have cell phones and they have a monthly plan, but some months they have to skip it, and that hurts their credit, and that hurts their access to like buying a mobile home with financing when they need a new mobile home down the road. And so their lives are still less stable than people who are comfortably in the middle class. They can afford sort of basic food, but they afford it less easily than other families, and so sometimes they might forego it. Sometimes they might have, spaghetti 3 days in a row because it's kind of the cheapest way to eat. So those things matter, and they matter also in how we think of our character as a country, because we define Americanness in this sort of nebulous way that sort of describes the way people's lives look. So, you have a house that's detached, and you have a car, and you drive to work, and you make lunch for your kids to take to school. That kind of character matters to people who can't quite reach that style, that quality of life,
Right. There's, I think it's James Baldwin who had the phrase, it's really expensive to be poor.
Mm-hmm.
One dimension is, urban life where you have, or even places that are very underbanked, for instance, stuff. I know what I cover pretty well. It's very, if you don't have a steady income, or you can't do direct deposit, for instance, which a lot of middle class people probably take for granted, it's very expensive to just get basic financial services, and things like utilities, where you may have to put a lot of money up front. That is, you really want liquid, or you really want to be investing, or you really want to have around, just to get like a phone line or electricity. The relative poverty, I'm asking you to go on a little bit more about that, because I think there's a lot of economists who fight about how important relative inequality is. And by relative, it's just, sometimes you'll see definitions that say Americans have the highest number of young people in poverty of any of the G20 or OECD, like the advanced nations. And by that, when they say that definition, they essentially mean young people who are living in households that have less than half the median income. So, essentially at the very low end. Now, if the median income is very high, that's still a lot of money. So there's a big debate about whether or not to be focused on that kind of absolute living standards, which are still obviously very relevant for people living in poverty in the United States, versus the kind of inequalityness of it, like why the income distribution is. I'm curious how a little bit more, if you could run a little bit more about how people experience that relative inequality and how it impacts both their practical lives and just how they feel about themselves as citizens and members of community.
Sure. Well, I think partly it very much affects actually what they can afford, right? So the story that I just wrote about the Denver suburbs, I spent time with families who were living in a hotel because they couldn't find another place to live. And a lot of them had lost their homes in the crisis. And either they owned their home and they were foreclosed on, or they rented a home and the owner was foreclosed on, or because of the bad economy, they lost their jobs and they couldn't afford to pay rent anymore. But it was all related to the Great Recession and the housing crash. And they couldn't find another apartment, partly because rents were really high in the area, because the Denver metro area, and especially the suburbs, are overall wealthy. So if you have a situation like that and you let the market set the rate for apartment building, or for apartments or for rental homes, then the people who are willing to pay more than the poorest citizens of that area can afford are going to drive the price up, right? So if they could find empty apartments, they were at rents that these families couldn't afford, and many of them were still working. They were working and they were earning middle class incomes, and they were mostly working in the service sector. So, or they had been working in the service sector. So, a gas station clerk or a grocery store clerk who went to college and then and got an associate's degree and then was still working at about the same level of income, or a mother who was working in a school cafeteria for low pay. So those families couldn't afford the apartments or the homes available to them in the area, and so they had to think about whether they wanted to leave the places that they grew up in, the places where their kids are in school, which is a traumatic decision, or they just had to make do with sort of living part-time in a hotel until they could find something. So I think that matters on that level, but it also matters as far as sort of how much they fit into the wider community too. So they can't, they can't go bowling or they can't go to the movies because it's too expensive. And so then they're living there in a different kind of way than what we think of as, life in America. And so that also affects how well they perform at school and how well they perform at work, because they don't have the same releases and leisure as their friends do. They can't go to friends' birthday parties because their parents can't afford to buy them a gift for the kids to take. They can't go to local events. They can't participate in extracurriculars. And so those things sort of, change the way, especially for kids growing up, change the way that they experience the community around them. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And you just referenced another story you wrote. Is it in the newest issue of the magazine?
That's right, March, April.
Excellent, of the American Press, which but I should have mentioned at the beginning, it has been it's been revamped to be bi-monthly, I think. Is this correct?
That's right.
It was revamped last year, and it's been a really I was a fan of it before, but it's been a very impressive revamp or reimagination of the project. So I think it's been a very good magazine recently. And
oh, thank you.
But yeah, this is in the latest issue, and it's a story about the Denver suburbs. And I think one thing that's been really interesting and I think devastating for a lot of working class households in a way that has not been properly articulated is the rental market in the Great Recession. Because, you obviously have a very large housing bubble, you have a very large housing crash. And, I forget the exact numbers, but, you're 4 to 5 million foreclosures, which is a lot of foreclosures. And they're pretty, they're concentrated in some areas, but, every community has at least some foreclosures. And I think that's been covered, even if the policy response is really terrible on it. But at the same time, you see a lot of rental markets start to really heat up, as in rents in urban areas particularly, especially ones with jobs, are going up very quickly, in part because in the Great Recession, the housing market, like just the infrastructure of it collapses. Like a lot of home builders go out of business, a lot of people, the financing for homes dries up. People are so concerned about whether or not they'll be employed next year that they start to pull back and they don't invest in housing, but they downshift into rentals, which puts a lot of pressure on a rental market that is in no position to expand and meet it. And your story talks about how this played out in the Denver suburbs for a working class family that has had some employment problems, but is also working within a city that just has a terrible rental market. So can you talk a little bit about that story and that background?
Yeah, affordable housing advocates have been warning for years that there wasn't enough affordable housing and there was going to be this huge crunch when all these families who were being foreclosed on needed to start renting. And it's turned out to really be true, and it's really true in the Denver metro area. A few things have happened in Denver. One, it sort of became a hot city for people to move, and so a lot of young college grads started moving there. I think it made it onto some magazine's list of best cities to live as a young person in the mid-aughts. And so a lot of college kids moved out there to live. And another thing that happened is that in the years that the housing boom was so high, it was really profitable for developers to build sort of bigger and bigger houses, but not apartment buildings. And so only 18,000 apartment units were built in the Denver metro area in the 10 years that included the crash from like 2000 to 2010, according to.
And I'm sure a lot were turned into condos during that time period.
I'm sure, yeah. And before, in the previous 10 years, it was something like 50,000, just to give a sense of the scale. So it was like less than half that were built in that time period. And so it just meant that when people were started to be foreclosed on, or when people had to move to more affordable housing, they were flooding a market that didn't have a lot of homes, and a lot of people were flooding it. And so I think the rental vacancy for the Denver metro area was 4.3% at the time that I looked, according to the Colorado Housing Authority. It was around 4%, which was the lowest it had been in 10 years. And so landlords could be really choosy. And all the families who I followed had been foreclosed on or evicted, so their credit scores were bad too. So, the families that could get into places were people who could pay, and they could pay a lot every month, and they had 0 black marks on their rental history. There's no sort of ordinance to encourage people to build affordable housing in that area. So, the Section 8 program is completely overburdened. It has only about 30 or 40 vacancies open up for its program every year. It does it on a lottery. distributes vouchers on a lottery every few years, and so every time it has a new lottery, it gets about 2,500 applications. So there's just way more need than it can meet. And that's been a huge problem as well. There just aren't a lot of places where it's relatively inexpensive for people to stay either short-term or long-term in that county. And that county is representative of the whole Denver metro area. So families can't even move close by.
Right. So like you see it in a lot of areas is that, all these homes go into foreclosure, and they're not homes that, in general, as you mentioned, they're been built in such a way to not make them rental units. They've been built in such ways to make them either they're explicitly single-family homes, but you see a lot of essentially, in some of the hotter housing markets, a lot of rental buildings were turned into condo units. Maybe you or a friend had to move out of an apartment building because your lease was up due to it switching hands. And when the foreclosure crisis hit, all those properties essentially go to the sidelines. You have what's referred to often as a shadow inventory, but homes that are sitting vacant, that are not being paid, but quasi in foreclosure. People have moved on, and for whatever reason, the banks do not want to sell them at a loss or otherwise put them in the market. So a lot of, you have a situation in which there wasn't enough rental housing anyway, and a lot of stuff that could be rental housing was sitting on the sidelines, which is really devastating. So I'm curious how the family you follow, in the story about the Weeklies, I believe they had you follow several families, but the core one you follow is had a landscaping business. Is this correct?
That's right. Yeah.
And so that's the kind of business that's obviously going to get really hard hit in a housing crunch when people are pulling back on a lot of services.
Yeah.
And in a recession broadly, I'm curious how they saw themselves fitting into the recession, because let me phrase the question differently. The two stories have two very different kinds of arcs to them, because in the first story you're talking about real generational poverty, and you talk a lot about the inheritance of poverty from the 60s on, where in the other one you have a working class family that's getting along pretty well, or well enough certainly, and then the Great Recession hits and it really wipes them out. And in an age of really high inequality, in an age when we're thinking a lot more about how we're just going to have a much bigger service class, their kind of business and the role they've played in the economy is kind of what it's going to grow relative in providing services to landscaping large homes, front lawns, and whatnot. I'm kind of curious how each of those families experience and conceptualize the Great Recession as either this thing that came out of nowhere, or just something that when to paraphrase a different phrase, when the regular economy caught a cold, they got pneumonia.
Yeah. I think that it's kind of hard to tell exactly how they conceptualize their role in it, because I was speaking to them way after, so they'd already thought about it and they'd already decided how they fit into it. And so, hindsight is 20/20, so maybe they made their stories fit a little bit better than they would have otherwise. But all of them described the recession as sort of forces beyond their control and systemic problems that didn't have anything to do with them or how worthy they were or how how hard they had worked. They all felt that they'd worked really hard. At the same time that they were kind of ashamed of the things that had happened to them. So it was kind of this weird duality where they felt both that they couldn't have done anything to prevent their situations, but also that they were sad about what had happened to them. They felt like they kind of internalized the fault as well. So it was kind of weird, and both of those things existed on separate tracks. But they all saw the recession as something that was beyond their control and the result of forces that were bigger than them and other forces to blame, like the banks or Wall Street or the government. But they also saw it coming earlier than everyone else. So the main family that I follow, Bonnie and her husband Andy and their son Drew, who's 14, they are a bit older, and they were working the landscaping business that they had inherited from Bonnie's father. They sort of saw that people were struggling to pay them or were sort of cutting back on their services as early as 2006 and 2007. So this started to happen to them. They were the front lines of how it happened to them. So they definitely felt like they were sort of at the bottom and everything was kind of falling down on them, even though they identified themselves as middle class before. They really felt like the recession was the fault of several years of bad acting on the part of banks. When I asked people when the last time, it was kind of easy or good to live in the area that they were in, they all said the 60s, which like few of them remembered. But they had this idea that the 50s and the 60s were sort of this halcyon time where you could get a stable job and you could have it forever and you could earn enough money to live and you could retire and have a pension. They had all experienced their parents doing that and their parents building up wealth, and they sort of knew that their wealth was very shallow, that they were hit so hard because they hadn't really built up enough, that they'd been hardworking, but that they knew they weren't rich. They just knew that they were middle class or working class. So they have tried to do different things. Different members of different families have tried to do different things to sort of work up and build up and increase their earning potential, but they all see it as sort of an uphill climb that isn't going to get them very far. So I have both of the families that I end up following in the story are older. One is a set of grandparents raising their grandchildren, and another is a set of older parents of the 14-year-old son, Bonnie and Andy. None of them really see that in their lifetimes they can return to good, stable jobs. They try to piece business back together a little bit at a time with different customers, but they sort of feel like their working lives are kind of done, and there's no way for them to recover what they've lost.
And then one thing I really liked about it is that especially in the weekly stories, it obviously jumped out from the setting, is that the kind of forces that keep people in poverty and keep people barely getting by. And for you get this impression of I'm not sure if the Ramada Inn is it's mentioned in the story.
Mm-hmm.
It's is it next to an expressway? Yes, it
is.
Okay, I'm looking at the story. But you get this idea of a small motel next to an expressway where people are staying week to week. And you're wondering, well, why can't you move somewhere else, or why can't people, somehow pull themselves up? And you get a real sense of just the constraining atmosphere of poverty in this. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit more just about people actually living in motels and hotels because the rental market's so bad, and how that just impacts both. You talk about spontaneous communities that kind of form, which is really fascinating, and small kind of kinship networks that try to help each other out. But at the end of the day, there's still a real barrier to being able to move out or otherwise live a fuller life in the community.
Yeah, I actually thought about it when you had the James Baldwin quote about how expensive it is to be poor, and I think a lot of these families who had been working class are experiencing that for the first time, and they all articulated that to me. Mike, who is a grandfather with two grandsons in the story, told me that he was just really shocked at how quickly it snowballed. That they all felt like they were falling into a hole that they couldn't get out of. And it's partly because it's actually pretty expensive to stay in the hotel. The rates for individuals to stay by the week, what I paid when I stayed there for 5 weeks, was $210. And then for families, it's a little bit more, and it varies sort of without warning. So some weeks the families had to pay $240. Some weeks in the summer when the tourist season was highest, it was $280. So they really sort of have to spend a lot of their cash on that, especially for families that are earning very little. There was a single mom there who was earning about $10,000 or $11,000 a year, and so that's a lot of her money. And actually, by the end of the month, she would usually have to borrow money from people. Her church helped her out a lot. She went to food banks to get food. She lost her food stamps at some point too because she was earning a little too much, so she had to really rely on the food banks and the soup kitchens and her church. So she, every time she turned around, every time she got a paycheck, the bulk of it went to this weekly rent. And actually, when you think about how much you're paying, if you pay $240 a week, let's say, you're paying about $1,000 a month on average for a room, basically. And it's a room where you can't cook very much food. It's a room where you can't store bulk items. So even if you could afford to go to Costco, you can't really keep that amount of food or goods there. You can't do anything else in your home. So if you had an opportunity to pick up extra work and do it at your house, you'd have trouble finding the space to do it. And you can't get around very easily because it's in the suburbs where you are near a highway. There's actually a state highway and then the interstate, so it's not very safe to walk. And there's a bus system in the county, but it doesn't run very well, and so you end up taking 2 hours to go 4 miles if you try to rely on the buses. And actually, one of the things that happened is that a lot of families, they often had old cars. Their old cars broke down, and they couldn't afford to get them fixed right away. So then the amount that they would have had to spend to fix the car kept growing and growing and growing. A lot of families would let their plates expire, and then that was okay until the year passed, and then they would have had to have new color tags for their car, and so they knew it would be more obvious. So they were afraid if they drove around, they'd get tickets. People did get tickets driving around, and they were tickets they couldn't pay, which of course makes the price of the tickets go higher and higher and higher. So that's sort of the traps people fall into, and a lot of people just end up abandoning their cars, which means they can't get to work on time, which means that they might lose their jobs or get in trouble at work, which puts them at jeopardy for getting a raise down the road. So all of these things really compound, and they've really started to fill it in the hotel because, they had to eat boxed macaroni and cheese and anything that they could cook in a microwave, which is more expensive than it would have been if they could have sliced up potatoes at home and cooked them on the stovetop. So, those things, all of them combined just to really wear people down. And anybody who had savings spent it down. Anybody who had a job struggled to make it to work on time. Anybody who was in school struggled to get their schoolwork done. So it was really sort of, they started to see how compounding poverty is. And I always think about that too in relationship to the Kentucky story, which is where we're talking about generations of people who've had to adapt to not having enough money. And so the way that you sort of live your everyday life when you don't have enough money for basic stuff really changes in a way that I don't think people realize unless they've ever experienced it.
Right. And it is shocking to think that through, right? Because it's the 21st century. We're the richest country in history, and we could have lots of hunger if it wasn't for food stamps. In fact, we still do.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people do struggle to just get food, and basic things like shelter and the weekly story, and then just basic things like food and whatnot. It's really shocking to think that, as weak as the welfare state is right now, it's holding together a lot of communities and a lot of people in a very thin way, even when there is so much, and there's so much inequality, and there's so much prosperity. I'm curious what it was like. You mentioned one thing that comes across in the reporting is the time dimension, which escapes from a lot of stories. Obviously, you get the sense that you have spent a lot of time. I mean, you just mentioned in this conversation, you spent 5 weeks in the Denver suburbs.
Yeah, I spent 5 weeks in the hotel.
In the hotel, okay, yeah. I don't know if that's mentioned there, but you get a sense of the reporting is being really, really embedded over time, which a lot of stories, especially now with the internet, the kind of immediate turnaround in Twitter of Twitterification of media, you don't see quite as much as anymore. What was it like to report these stories? What was it like to be embedded, to approach, the people in question? What was it like? Often I imagine a lot of communities are living, you mentioned crime in a couple of stories. People, communities at the margins often have, real needs as subjects to report on that you have to be careful with confidentiality.
Yeah.
What was it like to talk with these groups?
Yeah. Well, in the case of Kentucky, it was actually, I rented a trailer there for 2.5 months, and I was just sort of living in the rural area, and they're suspicious of people because they've been reported on a lot as sort of the hillbilly kind of area, and so I had to promise them I wasn't going to do a hillbilly kind of story, and I didn't want to. I wanted to do more of a story about, a family from generations of poverty trying to make its way into the middle or the working class, just to see how hard that struggle was. And so I think that after a while, people just got used to me, and they appreciated that I was there. So even if they didn't necessarily like the story that resulted, they liked that I really tried to get to know them and get to know the community and participated in it. And I went to a couple basketball games and went to the local meetings that they have at the local action center there, like the community action center. And so what was hard is that people do start talking to you and you want them to always remember that you're a reporter. So on the one hand, you want them to be less self-conscious around you and talk and act as they normally would without you being there. But you also don't want them to forget why you're there. You want them to you want to blend into the background, but you don't want anybody ever to think that you're their confidant, because you're not, because you're going to write about what they tell you. And so in Kentucky, actually people were pretty good about saying, oh, that was off the record, by the way, and, understanding what the boundaries were for the most part. And then I think that was harder in the weeklies because I was there. I didn't announce that I was there to the staff of the hotel. I didn't want them to treat me any differently. But when they asked me what I was doing, I told them the truth. And to everybody who was in the hotel and was talking to me, I told them the truth. And they really wanted to tell me about, the economy and the situations that they'd gotten into and, how they'd been kind of screwed over. But getting people to talk about their own financial situation is kind of hard, and figuring out exactly, I had to double check on a lot of different records from foreclosures and from evictions, and so double checking what people said against the documents is hard too, because sometimes they either don't remember or legitimately don't understand what happened to them, and so you have to sort of walk them through things and say, well, this doesn't match up with what you said, and that can be difficult. Those conversations can be difficult. But living in Kentucky was fine. It was just like living in a small town. Living in the Ramada was terrible, and I hated it. It was awful. It was awful to be there. It was awful to be crowded in that space. It was awful to sort of like figure out ways to eat food in that little room. It was awful to like not be able to open my window because I was on the second floor. It's possible that they're openable. I just didn't figure it out. It was really crowded and not necessarily pleasant to stay there, but I had to stay there to talk to people and figure out when they were coming home and figuring out when they were leaving and figuring out who to write about and what kind of community developed there. So I don't understand how people have done it for more than a month. I did it for 5 weeks, and I was so ready to leave by the time I left that, and I actually spent a lot of time trying to escape, and I carved out a little time for myself every Sunday night to like go to the movies or something like that. Or my sister lives in Denver, and so I would hang out with her. So I really felt a lot of sympathy for families who were trying to live there long term, because it's just not a house, and after a while you just want a place where you can spread out and have room and move from one room to another and sit down at a table and chair and eat your dinner like a family around a table. And so that stuff was really difficult, and that really made me understand what they were going through. I'm really lucky because I think that stuff is really important, real kind of reporting, especially right now when we have a lot of things that need to be documented for the future, like, what's happening to families in the Great Recession. I am lucky that I work for a magazine that lets me do that lets me go take 5 weeks. And I had to report on the election a little bit while I was there, but for the most part, when I take these reporting trips, that's my primary job. And that's what I get to concentrate on, and then I get time to write it when I return. Not a lot of people have that, and I think it's a real travesty for journalism, because I think people like it. The articles that I write that have that embedded reporting do the best on the web. They have great traffic. They get a lot of response. People like them. So I think that there's a real need among readers for that. There's a real need for the country to record what's happening right now, and there aren't a lot of people doing it. And so that's one of the things that I think is hard.
Yeah, in the middle of the weekly story, the family, or one of the families, while they're struggling in the process of losing their home, they get a call from a group, I just looked it up, Colorado Home Savers, mm-hmm. which is clearly, as they find out, is a kind of a scam operation. Mm-hmm. And I remember when, I've been doing policy and writing about housing for a couple of years now, and I remember when, the scam groups first started to really come into force on in relation to a couple programs the administrations were doing that were really kind of poorly thought out, like HAMP and a couple other groups. You'd have a lot of people who are, very desperate. They want to keep their homes. They're not in a lot of financial straits. Will, send checks off to groups that are obviously scam artists. Mm-hmm. And the way, and it's weird to see it kind of float in and out of the story, like, because it's something that happens, but it's one of many things that are bad and kind of scam artisty and that happened to the family. Mm-hmm. And so to see that and to understand it's nothing. It's not being a reporter. It's not something I would see through that lens. It's something that's like another hassle that another kind of group of people said that they're going to help them, but kind of rip them off. Mm-hmm. To see it play out that way is, I think, very powerful, and I think it kind of gets to a lot of the barriers that a lot of groups like this face. I'm curious what you think of how there's obviously a big detach between people who are writing and people who are otherwise embedded with the public sphere of kind of determining what we're going to do about the Great Recession, mm-hmm. and people who are actually experiencing poverty, either in the Great Depression for the first time or the Great Recession for the first time in their lives, or generationally. There's obviously a gap where reporters, pundits, policy experts, senators tend to be elite educated. They also tend to be white male. They tend to be doing, if not very well, they tend to be doing pretty well. Or, if there's a lot of background support either through foundations or family or other things that kind of make sure that they get by from one place to another. I'm curious how you see the disconnect playing out between, a lot of people say that unemployment's not a big problem, or a lot of people say that the reason unemployment's not a big problem for people in DC is because, people in DC are doing pretty well if they're connected to the kind of larger government project. How do you see the bigger conversations about things like wealth and unemployment and austerity play out given the lack of this kind of systemic knowledge of poverty?
Yeah, it's hard because actually the problem is the disconnect is, really well documented. It's called the last mile problem, and a lot of different people don't know, they think about it, but they don't know exactly how to solve it. And it's actually a good place for reporters to go because there's a lot of stuff going on there in the last mile. But it's I
actually have no idea what the last mile problem is, and the audience might not either.
Yeah, sure. It just describes the last steps that any kind of program or policy has to take to get to the people it's meant to help. And so what you see happens is that there's a program set at the national level, and it provides some money and some guidelines, and it goes to the states, or it goes to a local entity, or it goes to a community group, or it goes to like a college to implement. And then that college or that program has a lot of good ideas about how to implement it, and then something happens in the space between that group and the community it's meant to help that just sort of keep it from having the desired result. And I think that's a good way to describe it. That's the best I can do. But I think that it's interesting because I think part of the reason it exists is because DC as a place and also as a sort of idea, the DC think tank kind of world or whatever, for the most part, they are well-meaning, but they're very results-oriented. So, they would say, well, we need to end hunger, so we're going to provide money directly for people to buy food through the food stamp program. Or there's not enough low-income students going to college. We're going to get a college readiness program started in low-income communities. And all of those things are good things to do, but they sort of are narrow in their focus, and they don't encompass the whole holistic kind of experience of being a poor person. And so, if you are struggling to live or grow up below the poverty line, you don't have enough food, but you also don't have a comfortable place to live, most likely. You're either in substandard housing, or you lose your home and you're in a hotel like the kids that I followed there. And you don't have an easy time getting to school. So you're either walking to school for an hour, or your parents drive you in a car that breaks down all the time. You go to school hungry and tired because you don't have enough food and you're uncomfortable. And so you struggle to learn, especially like on Mondays, because Mondays is a whole weekend of not having enough food and you haven't eaten at school, which a lot of kids have access to now. And you go home and you don't have a comfortable place to do your homework, so maybe you don't get your homework done. And the same is true of adults who are working. So you go and you work in a low-wage job where you have very few rights, you have very few benefits, like even sort of the easy benefits where, like, today I'm taking, 30 minutes out of the normal course of my workday just to have this conversation with you, which is fine. But in other places that wouldn't be part of, just sitting down and talking to somebody isn't part of your job. Your job is to stand up at a cash register or to stock shelves. And so you have to do that all the time. And maybe if you're lucky, you get a 30-minute lunch break and a couple 15-minute breaks, but a lot of times you don't. And you're tired physically when you come home, and you don't have enough money to order a pizza, so you have to make food, and you have to stand up even longer to cook food for your family. And there's not enough food, and so everybody's hungry, and there's not a good place to sit down and eat it, so it's not a relaxing experience. And maybe you can't afford cable, so there's no way for you to kind of just turn on the TV and veg out for a little while, which is something that all middle-class families do, is sort of find a way to relax. And I think we judge families who are poor as a society for trying to afford those things. We think, well, they can't afford cable. Why are they trying to pay for cable? But it's because they're, everybody is the same kind of person, and everybody wants to have the same sort of like leisure space and relaxation space. And so, so you're in a place where you can't really afford those things. And if you try to, people judge you. You can't afford to take a class at a local community college and try to earn your 4-year degree, but maybe you can scrape together enough money for a training program that somebody has told you will get you a good job as like a medical transcriptionist or something like that. Down the road, that job disappears because everything becomes, everything becomes an electronic file, and so then you have to go through a training program again. So it's this sort of like never-ending cycle of not quite having enough and being in a good place and having enough rest and having enough sleep and having enough to eat that compounds over time. So I think that's part of the problem, is that there's just not a sense of that among a lot of really good and well-meaning thinkers. That poverty doesn't end just because you give people food stamps. And poverty doesn't end just because you try to provide a pathway into an educational program. Poverty ends when people have all of the range of things that they need and never have to forego one for the other, and are healthy and are happy and are working in jobs that are rewarding. It's one of the things we talk a lot about here, because a lot of the people who work with me at the Prospect have, really varied experiences. They didn't just go to Ivy League colleges and then come to DC to be reporters or work in government. And so, we know people who struggle through this, and sometimes hard work isn't rewarding, and sometimes scrimping and saving never ends. Sometimes it's your whole life, and that just really gets really old, and it changes the way that you think about the future, and it changes the way that you think about potential down the road. And I think that that's one of the things that we're not really prepared to reckon with as a country, is that, this idea of endless opportunity disappears for some people because they've never seen it to be true. And so, trying to inspire people to work hard or to go to college or whatever falls flat when you've never seen anybody do that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so to kind of continue that and to conclude on this question, I think for a variety of reasons, or at least there's a potential where the way the economy is evolving, the way social programs are evolving, you could see a genuine push for something like a basic income.
Mm-hmm.
It could be through the tax code or through a couple other things. But the idea is that as you point out, a lot of these results-focused policies, well-meaning or not well-meaning, often are just kind of disasters. Like, the idea is we want people to have good food, so we, do food stamps, but then they, that doesn't necessarily translate into good food. We want people to go to college, but, sometimes there's significant leakages and breaks, and sometimes they're addressing problems as conceived by people who are very far away from the actual problem that they're experiencing. But we do know that money can solve a lot of problems.
Yeah.
And a lot of times what you see is problems of character or will, or not lacking this or that, are really just problems of poverty, just not having enough. And, not having enough money is actually makes little problems a lot more difficult to deal with. So I'm curious how the families you've encountered, and they're obviously it's not a polling sample, but how they experience the state, how they experience things like Medicaid or food stamps, and how they view themselves vis-a-vis the way the welfare state works to both kind of boost incomes and create jobs and do other things, and whether or not they think that that's an essential part of how the economy needs to evolve. They think they actually really hate the fact that they're entangled in the system, or other things that you've observed them.
Yeah. Well, in Kentucky, people hated the welfare state. They thought it was degrading and it trapped people in dependency. But that was different because this was a situation in which the poverty rate was very high. It was like 40% poverty. And so that was an interesting situation because all of those people could have used more money, but few of them wanted just to take it. They wanted to be able to work and work in good jobs, and those jobs just weren't available. The jobs that were there were physically demanding and difficult and hard to get to because they were out in a super rural area. So that was sort of a very particular situation that was unique to that area. In Colorado, a lot of the families weren't ashamed to seek help because they felt like they'd spent their lifetimes paying into those programs and they were supposed to be there for them when they fell on hard times. All of them said it wasn't enough. Food stamps weren't enough to eat on all month. A lot of the families who would have qualified for TANF, which is what replaced welfare, stands for Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. The max benefit in Colorado is $462 a month, and you have to work for that with an approved employer, which could be anything like a state agency to a private sector employer who is working with the state to employ people. So you have to work about 30 hours a week for $462 a month, which works out to be almost nothing, right? So the families decided that wasn't worth it for them a lot of the time. One working mom decided to forego welfare because her husband owed, and also she tried to forego her husband's child support because she knew that the state would reimburse itself. If she got on welfare and her husband paid child support, the state would take his welfare or take his child support and reimburse itself for the cost of her welfare, which is another thing that a lot of states do. And so families sort of developed their own kind of markets for things like that. So she just had her husband pay her to stay in the hotel while she was there, with the threat that otherwise it would be child support. Like if he didn't do this, she was going to go after him for child support. Not in those overt terms, but that was kind of what the deal that they worked out. So especially with welfare, though, it's so little money and so much work to get it. You have to go through approval processes. You have to look for work at the same time that you have to work. That people thought it was better for them to take kind of side jobs under the table to the extent that they could, or to try to find other ways of getting income. And so I think that's a really big lesson for people who care whether these policies are working, is that the families who finally receive welfare and seek it out have literally gone through every other possibility. They're so desperate for money that they've decided that this is the last program available to them and they'll have to work with it. And also with food stamps, at the same time that people thought that they were not enough money, these same people, some of whom were sort of politically conservative, would tell me that the government needed to cut spending. So they thought they should increase food stamps, increase Social Security, increase Medicare, and protect those programs and protect Medicaid. But at the same time, they thought the government should spend less money. And they thought they should spend less money on things like foreign aid to foreign countries. And so, sort of like the global responsibility of what the actual government pays for is confusing to people, and almost everybody who's at the bottom thinks that other families at the bottom need more help.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Enjoy the nice weather and keep up the great reporting, Monica. Take care.